the Germans are like, what are we going to do now? And then, so, they get, so, these are some of the generals. And Falkenhayn, this German guy is like, I've got this plan. We're going to go, like, this fort at Verdun. It's like historic, like, it's kind of like a symbol for the French people, and we're going to give it everything we got. We are just going to bombard Verdun, and we're going to bleed France, like France white. We're going to bleed them white. They're not going to ever want to give up. This is what he's thinking. Not going to want to give up Verdun. So we're just going to channel them into this meat grinder of machine guns and just destroy them right here. And then so Papa Joffrey, he's like the supreme commander. He's like, no retreat. If you do, that's death penalty. So no retreating. And then so Sergeant Petain, he's like on the ground. He's like, oh God, like, all right, might as well throw myself into it. And then that's where the term like, they shall not pass comes from, like, ils ne passent pas, like that was the war cry for Verdun. And like basically was like a death knell for them. Because they fell right into the Germans' plan of churning up these dead people. And, like when they first started at Verdun, the French people had given up on Verdun. There wasn't a whole lot of people there. There was just like a cursory unit, because in their mind with this trench warfare going on, forts didn't matter anymore. The trench was where the war is at. So this like castle was like undefended. So when the Germans lobbed artillery in for days and days and days, and then they sent scouts out, they didn't see like a whole lot of dead people. And they looked back further, and just then was the French coming in to reinforce Verdun. Just then were they coming in. So that's all the scouts saw. And it says in a lot of places, if Germany had attacked again right then, they probably could have taken Verdun, but that wasn't the point. The point was to churn up dead people. And when he says, ils ne passent pas, like, that's what they wanted. They wanted all this, like, deadness. So these are, like, the three moves they made around Verdun. Verdun's down here. They never actually reached it. And they had, along this line here, from Hill 304 to Damlock, there were 1,200 large artillery guns in the span of basically like 4 miles. So they came right at it first. The black line is the trench line, by the way. So they're going to push the trench line down. And if you can see, everything like north of this Marne River, the Côte des Talus, Côte des Poivres, Taimont Farm, is still, it was hammered, and it was just bombed and shot up and bled upon so badly that even today you cannot live on it. You can't grow a thing on it, you can't build anything on it. These are just like permanent dead zones. And then at this point, the Germans totally overtook the French. They got all these forts over here. But then at this side, this butt zone, like, there's no river, there's no natural landmark except 2 big mountains here. And where this is a huge forest. So what the French did is they set up with all their machine guns in the forest, and as the Germans streamed over these hills, they just mowed them down. They're falling down the front, they're falling in the sides, they're falling in the back. So that, while this over here was like massive French casualties, this was a really bad German casualty. I mean, it was just a grisly war. It was just churning up blood, and there's like body parts everywhere. There's like death and pestilence. Like people were just going insane, and also sickness was really becoming a horrible problem. There was like 4 main ones, from like horrible to like inconceivably horrible. The first one people would get would be like trench foot, which was basically, they never had a dry foot. It was either like water captured in their boot or their sock never got dry, or a lot of soldiers, like, they couldn't even stand it anymore. They just went in bare feet on this like awful ground that's been churned up in like body parts, like biological materials all over the ground. So, I mean, like, there'd be blisters, sores, and then those would open up. There's tons of bacteria everywhere. And this is bad because then the soldiers, like, they can't even, like, walk forward. So while this doesn't kill you, this, like, takes soldiers out. And then the lice that was in these trenches brought on trench fever, which, like, just totally took you out. You had to go out to the medic, and the thing about trench fever, it like took they didn't like let you go home after you got sick or your leg blown off, like they would just put you right back on. But the bad thing about trench fever is usually they'll sew up your arm and just send you back out there. You couldn't even get out of bed for 2 months. So it was like not killing somebody but taking them out for 2 months. And then there was typhoid, especially in Gallipoli. Like, a lot that was written about Gallipoli from the British are just like every fly in the world is right here. And that, they, like, with that wrote like typhoid, which was like diarrhea, no vitamins in your body, like you just are drained completely. And then the simplest thing is like influenza was like not that curable without medicine or anything else, and that was airborne. So in every level, from the ground to things that are jumping on you and landing on you, everywhere is things that are making you sick. And just the whole landscape, it was just bombed, like huge shells everywhere. It's just torn, France is like torn apart. And so like it's getting towards the end of Verdun, and each side has lost like hundreds of thousands of people. It's awful. They're literally like throwing gas bombs into the French trenches, and it looks like really bad. And actually the guy who said, we shall not pass, he actually asked Joffrey, like, can we retreat now? Like, is that gonna work? But in the meantime, Russia has a push. In the same time, in 1916, Russia has a push. So making Germany has to divert 400,000 troops from Verdun to Russia to deal with the Russians so they don't break through that line. And then in the meantime, to take off a little pressure, this was their idea, take off a little pressure from Verdun. In a big way, the British and French started a war at Somme, which is not a city, but it's a river, which was a awful war for the Allies. We eventually sort of won, but there was no winner. Like, we got our point across, but we lost so many people, or you know what I mean. And it was by a river, so like the way things blew up, it would transport more liquid everywhere, making just the bacteria pestilence situation like, out the roof. And also like the French and British were like running out of trucks and stuff, so they were galloping on horses into battle, into lines of machine guns at the Battle of Somme, and they just like got mowed down. Just so many machine guns were coming at them. Just like absolutely devastation. And so for the battle, and then by December, both of these battles were pretty much over. Both sides were exhausted. Over that year, like 2 million people died. 2 million people died over those two battles. In the Battle of Verdun, there was like more than 400,000 French and British soldiers and 360,000 German soldiers. And then the little diversionary war, the Somme, actually had way more deaths. The French and British forces had to spend like 623,000 soldiers to relieve the pressure and end these two awful battles that happened. And this might not come across, but like when you talk about like how many people are dying, like 2 million people, you can't like think of what that is. And for example, like if you think of a packed show at these different venues, Like, I just went to the Raven Stadium for the Justin Timberlake concert, and that's 70,000 people, and that's like Raven's Super Bowl amount. Like, teeming with people, if you can imagine that. And that was that's 70,000. And like, there were some battles during the Battle of Verdun, during the span of like 2 days, you can imagine the amount of Camden Yards emptying of dead people. You know, that's a battle that took 1 day. But the thing about the Somme was this is the first time we ever saw tanks on a battlefield. And like, they're like, you know, tanks is a big step in war. But the thing that British messed up about this is that it wasn't like loaded with guns and come in like to the British people. They basically filled it up with like bullets and like more weapons, like reinforcement weapons. Because there was hard, like once we broke through the trenches, it was hard to get, like, it was hard to hold your ground because you'd run out of bullets and bombs and stuff. So they were really used as a protective, you know, transport to bring them more supplies. You know, and people think I drew a lot of tanks. Here's some like wacky looking tanks. Most of them like look like this. And they're up like this to cross trenches. That was the idea. If you think of like the balance ratio of what that is, they sort of could cross some trenches. And then obviously some of these other ones are just transports. Or like small tank. This is a tank that I saw in a book that was tank treads, but it had like a horse carriage top to it. But these kind of things were used to like bring artillery in, drew more tanks. This is a fun tank. That's a British tank, like late war British tank, and they did use it for shock. And then also back to like what the air battle is like. Zeppelins were used a lot. Zeppelins were actually used to bomb. They actually got Zeppelins to London, and London was bombed from Zeppelins for like months. It actually caused 1,000 civilian deaths from lobbing these, like, you see there's like the handle here, it's like a lantern, and you just like drop it down. And they also would use this kind of thing to bomb where they built Zeppelins. They would try to see where they built Zeppelins, like the big barns that they used, and they would try to bomb them. And then also, they had these planes, like the Wright brothers, like this is like 1916, like the Wright brothers was like 1904. But then in 1908, that's when the military bought the design of an airplane, and then, you know, after the start of the war, then they were like, okay, let's try to get some airplanes, even if it's like reconnaissance airplanes. And in the beginning, it was like wood, canvas, like literally, oh, and going back to the Zeppelin, Zeppelins were made of like aluminum structures and, it's a German word, but lacquered cow intestines was like the body, the thing that got filled up with helium. And then like eventually like the technology came on so fast that like as the war went on, they were able to have these like incredible, like you hear about like the Red Baron, like dog fights where they're doing spins and they're like firing machine guns at each other. And one of the craziest things that like the like they tried all these designs to get a gun in the front, and it was like they couldn't really figure it out. They put like 2 propellers and then like a guy in the middle and then a driver behind him, but it didn't really work. But then like they developed the technology to get the bullets to synchronize with the propeller in the front, which is insane to me. I can't even. I'm just a scientist for that. This is just some more airplanes that I drew. Okay, so at this point in the war, you know, Germany had just like lost a ton of people at Somme and Verdun, and they're like, okay, you know what, we got this new plan, we're going to back it up and we're going to regroup. We're going to go back to the Hindenburg line, we're going to regroup, we have lots of awesome reinforcements there. And then the British were like, like, all right, we lost a lot of people, but like, we gotta keep going. So they just like give them everything they got. They're firing into the German zones. But this Hindenburg line is like well defended. Like they have underground like cities and stuff. So you know, with tons of weapons, they're like doing all right back at the Hindenburg line. And they're also like, like there's something going on here, so like I'm gonna wait this out a little bit before we go attacking first. And what was going on was the Russian Revolution. Like, so at one point, it was first, the women were doing everything in Russia at this point. Their men were dying by tens and hundreds of thousands, millions eventually. So they were taking up all the stuff, they were making everything, they were putting the food together, they were making the whatever bullets they had, they were doing everything. And at a certain point, the conditions, as you can imagine, in Russia were horrible. So, like, 90,000 women go on strike. They're like, no, everything's wrong. And then the next day, 150,000 men go on strike, of the men that are left. So then, like, the government's like, okay, that's it, we're done. Like, all our people are starving and sad, so like, we're done, this government isn't working. So basically what happened is like the upper middle class, like yuppies of Russia, they came into power and they were like, all right, democracy, everyone's equal. We're gonna let the criminals that the Tsar had, we're gonna let them out. We're gonna let the exiled people back in. Everything's equal. They were like, let's do this. Like, let's try this democracy thing. And then, but one thing they did not do is be like, we're gonna get out of this war. They were like, we're gonna do all that cool stuff, but we need to stay in this war. We're gonna be weak if we don't. So we're staying in this war. That was the one thing that really needed to change. So Lenin had been exiled, like he'd been exiled by the Tsar. So when they let exiled people back in to the country, Lenin was on the first train, and the story is he got off that train, and people were waiting for him. Thousands of people were waiting for him to get off this train. And he goes up, he's like, he like steps up on top of a car, and then like orates to everybody, and like people are like, "Grr!" And by like he comes back like late May, early June. By September, he has the country ready for another coup. And that's when the Bolshevik Party takes over, which is communism. And everybody's like, yay, new government, the one that we can stick with. And then Lenin was like, okay, we're out of the war. You'll all get your schedule for your factory work on Monday. like he was like, things are going down now. And people like, and then the world was like, oh boy. So Russia basically like leaves the war. So Germany's like, yes, we can put all our troops into like killing the French. We're taking Paris. Once we take Paris, like that's it. We got this. But what? This is an American soldier. I downloaded American flag, which this should be, but I couldn't find it on my computer, so this is like representing America. Something incredibly stupid that the German people did at this time, because they were like, we're gonna get it, like it's going down, like we're about to win. They telegram Mexico and Japan, and they're like, hey, remember when like America took all your land? Like remember Texas? Aren't they jerks? Don't you want to fight with us? Why don't you start like helping us and fighting with us? And they did the same thing to the Japanese people, the Germans did. And we got all those telegrams. We got all the Zimmerman telegrams. Zimmerman, who is this? It's like all ages. Zimmerman's messing with us. And also, like we already had our hand in the war. As far as like supplying the war goes, we had like about a 65-35 split between giving stuff and selling stuff to the Allies and selling stuff to the Central Powers. So we had a lot more invested financially in joining Germany, Britain and France. We had a lot more invested in that. Woodrow Wilson sends our boys to war. And this is a doughboy. That's what they call like the first American soldier. And this is also a good example of what like a typical World War II uniform was like. And the Americans really had it right by the time they went to war, because like at the beginning of the war, everybody's uniforms were like a mix of like really awful materials and like really antiquated ideas about like what war was. Like for example, like the French uniform in the beginning of the war had a scarlet red hat and scarlet slacks. So you can imagine like some French people like coming down the battlefield. You can see this like red beacon from like 2 miles away in your scope. So it's just like ding, ding, ding. Same thing with the Germans. When the war started, they wore these like cool hats with like a big spike on the top. They thought they were like super badass. It was like pickle hog, which should have like alerted them to the fact it's not badass. But when they got rid of the pickle hogs, head deaths went down by 70%. Because you would like imagine like coming, imagine like coming over a hill. You see that pickle hog first. So you have that like extra second to like aim in there. So America, fresh with money and bullets and weapons, like slides through the British Channel and like starts helping out the British. At first, the first month we did 133,000 men were sent, but by when we were churning, there were millions over there, 250,000 a month. Like guys ready to fight. We're streaming in 1917, like three years into the war, like giving Britain and France like a lot of relief. And at that time, Germany was still building crazy weapons. First they had like shells that were this big that fit in 2 like large artillery guns. Then they had even larger bombs and artillery shells. And by the end, they had a gun. They called it the Paris gun. This one at the bottom. And they also like judged artillery units how many men were controlling it. Like that's how big it was. And like the ones that were like pulled by horses, like 2 or 3 people. And then there's larger ones who needed like basically a whole battalion. And then the Paris gun needed like a couple battalions to even run this thing. It could shoot. What they did is the line got frighteningly close to Paris. 70 miles to be exact, and that was the distance that this gun could shoot into Paris. They were firing gigantic shells into Paris from behind lines, killing civilians at this point. This is when like America's coming in. So Germany's like, you know what? Like this is the second battle of the Somme. Like we're back. It's happened. They've had a lot of repeat battles, but they're like, this is the Battle of the Somme. It's right in the middle of Paris and the British Channel. And the British Channel is the most important thing to England, and Paris is the most important thing to France. So they're like, we're going to hit them hard at the Somme, and then they're going to split up. The British people are going to be like, we got to defend the Channel. And other people are like, we got to defend Paris. But that didn't happen. What actually happened is, they were a little relieved, and the War Council came together stronger than it was before. And then over the next like 10 months, the Allies gradually, through a series of battles, took back the land. Back to Belgium, back to Luxembourg, back through Alsace-Lorraine, the country they wanted, the part of their country that they wanted in the first place. And then on the 11th day, 11th month, 11th hour, Germany quit the war.
Is that for real? Like the 11th month, the 11th day, on the 11th hour, this documented history?
Yeah.
It's a cultist.
But the death toll is amazing. It's so staggering. Of the Allies, the Allies lost a lot more troops. If you can see, they committed 42 million soldiers to the war. Out of that is like 5 million dead. And 2.8 wounded. And when you talk wounded, this is like inconsolably wounded. This is like no body below your waist. This is like, and then of this circle, you gotta wonder how many shell shocks there are. Basically all of them. I don't know how you couldn't. And then as you can see, the Central Powers, they lost a lot less, but they spent a lot more. They had fancier weapons. That was the kind of difference between the Allies and the Central. And then this is after the war. This is how everything got set up. If you can remember, like, Germany and Austria-Hungary like controlled all of this. So after the war, things really got split up, and that's where like a lot of those countries are still countries. Or things that happened is Russia got really isolated. They had to pay back like so much money, and they were like in really big trouble, and they couldn't do anything after the treaty. It was just like they were so boxed in and isolated, and it was like the perfect place for these, like, for this isolation, like anger, like brooding, boiling anger of everybody else. This like angry nationalism grow, which like eventually turned into fascism. So it like planted the seed, that boxing Germany in after this war as part of the treaty, like was just another step onto the Second World War. Also, we got communism from the First World War, or like, you know, the start of communism. And also, we activated the American militarism complex. Like, you know, as the war went on, we were making most of the bullets and selling them to both sides. And then another thing about America is that, you know, in Germany and France, they've been at war for a long time, so they had these established factories that made bullets from that time. Like, they had a factory that made bullets in 1870. You know, so they kind of had old equipment, they were making things antiquated, and they were trying to update their machinery to make these new weapons that they were developing. But America came in at like 1917 when they had already done that stuff. So they're building factories to make the forefront of weaponry. Like, they come in after people are making the old stuff. So their factories are specifically made to do the new stuff, which basically put us, that's kind of where we got our superpower rank from, when we started having all these munitions and war factories. I mean, like, when they got into war, the DuPont factories tripled in America just to make enough stuff to fire at each other. Okay, that's it. Thank you very much.